What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Modern video. And I thought I was out of decks, honestly, for Modern after we kind of looked at the 5-color creativity deck that kind of rose in popularity with 5-color, or with the Elementals deck and the Orion decks kind of running around and kind of finding its place in the metagame. I thought we were basically out of decks. Well, thankfully, the Modern format continues to prove me wrong and actually has us a sweet take on a domain deck. Really quickly, before we actually even go take a look at the deck, the domain deck is essentially trying to play as many basic land types as possible, the 5 total that you can actually play in a game of Magic. So today we're going to be taking a look at a domain zoo deck for the Modern format, featuring a companion that is pretty popular like the Death Shadow decks, and probably really one of two playable companions left in the format. So let's go ahead, take a look at the deck, and see how it works. So here we have the Domain Zoo deck, piloted by Chachi Buyo. I hope that I'm saying that right. Piloted to a 5-0 finish in a Modern League just this past month. And usually when we look at some of the Modern League decks, I do kind of like looking at the challenge decks more so than leagues. This one being the probably the most up-to-date list that I've seen that kind of matches what I had been seeing from the Modern format. And even with it being like a 5-0 deck list, the cards in here are not very different, I would say, from what you would find in like those typical deck lists, especially the ones that you'd see in paper. But before we get too deep into the nitty gritty of this deck, I would appreciate it if you have not already subscribed to the channel. And of course, if you're new, to go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It's free, easy thing to do to support my content. We're almost at 100 subscribers, which is super exciting. Just inching closer like every day. It's awesome. So I'd appreciate it if you could help me and the community at large get past that milestone and start working towards 1,000, because that would just be really surreal thing to do, especially with the slow start I think we had to this year. Also, if you have not already done so, go ahead and go follow the link in the description of this video to go to the Discord server to basically talk about Magic, hang out, and things like that. Also, I'm going to be trying streaming on Twitch and YouTube as well, so if that is something that interests you, also on top of all the other content and stuff that I produce, go ahead and of course subscribe to the channel. Go over to Twitch if that is your preferred method of viewing, and go ahead and leave a follow over there as well. So here we go. Without further ado, the Domain Zoo deck. This one is pretty simple. It's a deck that focuses on having the basic land types in place. So you have cards like the Triome Cycle, Indutha Triome, and then like Sanders Lounge, that all have 3 keywords on them. In the case of like Sanders Lounge, Island Swamp Mountain, Indutha Triome, Plains Swamp Forest. They have basic land types, and essentially the cards that this deck plays cares about having those basic land types. You have cards like Ragavan, it's just a very, very good 1-drop, probably the best red 1-drop that you can play in the format if you're not playing Burn and your name is not Goblin Guide. Ragavan just completely warps the format around it. It's still a card that needs to demands an answer when it is played on an uncontested board. Wild Nacatl is a card that has not seen play for a long time and kind of sees play in like these zoo type decks because it is a 1 mana 3/3. It is probably one of the best rates that you can get on a card at 1 mana. It gets +1/+1 as you control a mountain, +1/+1 if you control plains. Always on like turn 2, it's a 3/3, and with the help of some of the triomes, you are able to make this a 3/3 and achieve, the perfect domain of having all 5 basic land types between 2 lands. Of course, it's being perfect because of your 2 drops, Nishoba Brawler, which is new from the new Dominaria set, where its power is equal to the number of basic land types that you control, and it has trample. So it's a 2 mana 5/3, usually on turn, or 2 mana 4/3, excuse me, on turn 2. If you have the shock lands, if you end up being able to get a Triome like on turn 1, kind of meaning that you can't cast either of these two, but having a Triome, you're able to play this thing as a 5-power beater on turn 2. Same thing with Territorial Kavu. Its power and toughness is equal to the number of basic land types. It also has the added bonus of getting to exile up to 1 card from a graveyard when it attacks, or discarding a card and drawing a card. The looting can be very important, just getting through the other lands and stuff in your deck. You are playing 21 lands. It's not a whole lot, but with a curve as low as this one, definitely getting to loot away those extra lands and have the potential to draw more spells is always very good. Cyanide Draco, it says it's a 12 drop. It's an honorary 2 drop because it does cost 2 less to cast for each basic land type that you have among lands. So you can also just play this on turn 2 by fetching up a Triome on turn 1 and then getting a shock land that is the two opposite, or I guess the two types that are left that aren't on the Triome. It's essentially ends up being a 2 mana flying 4/4 that creatures have vigilance if they're white, hexproof if they're blue, lifelink if it's black, first strike if it's red, trample if it's green, and it's all creatures you control. So Scion can give like Wild Mikado trample. The Brawler doesn't really get anything because it already had trample. Territorial Kavu gets trample and gains first strike, and Ragavan gains first strike. On top of like whatever other creatures Ragavan could take, they'll end up getting these keywords. While Scion is probably more used for just being a giant flyer that dodges like super early unholy heats, just as long as they're not delirious. Dodges fatal push, also dodges the prismatic ending and things like that, with the added bonus of sometimes giving a relevant keyword to one of your threats. So that's the core of the deck. You have 20 creatures that are all really aggressive odd rate that can get into the red zone, and most of them kind of care about your basic land types, with the Brawler, the Kavu, and the Scion Draco being the most important ones to have, all of your basic land types essentially out on turn 2. You have Teferi, Time Raveler. I think it serves two roles in this deck. One, it stops the Cascade decks from getting to do their thing, forces like the control players and stuff like that to play at sorcery speed. Stops the Rhino player from making tons of Rhinos, even though like your creatures are going to be bigger than Rhinos a lot of the time. Just still really nice to essentially have that insurance where they have to be able to answer the Teferi and go off on the same turn. Teferi can also gain you like a lot of tempo. I mean, you're really not like the only spell that you're really casting with this thing at instant speed with this +1 is Tribal Flames, which don't get me wrong is very good, but definitely not the reason why you're playing Teferi. You are definitely using it for the tech. Essentially, it gives you against like the Cascade decks and some of the decks that maybe want to play a more instant speed type game. 12 spells, really 16 other spells. You have Leyline Binding, which is essentially a 1 mana removal in this deck. You get to exile target non-land permanent and opponent controls until Leyline Binding leaves the battlefield, which of course then, ends up getting one less for each basic land type you have. 6 mana total, ends up being 1 mana in this deck. You have Lightning Bolt and Stubborn Denial. You're really not getting Delirium, so Unholy Heat's not very good. Lightning Bolt just having the option to deal 3 damage to the face and just be able to target anything. It has that versatility. Of course, getting to upstairs is kind of the most important part, probably what sets it apart from other 1 mana burn spells that you would play in this deck. For Stubborn Denial, because most of your creatures, aka your 3 biggest creatures, are always going to enable you to cast it with Ferocious, and also just a Stubborn Denial that's kind of like a poor man's like Force Spike is good enough a lot of the time, where you can just get people in a format where like they want to tap out to like do their thing. Tribal Flames deals X damage to creature or player, where X is the number of basic land types among lands that you control. So 5 damage straight to the face in a deck where you have a bunch of 5 and 4 power creatures. Tribal Flames can just end the game out of nowhere. The mana base, you don't get to play really any of the channel lands. You actually just flat out don't get to because they don't have the basic land types. So you are just playing a ton of fetch lands. You're playing a ton of triomes, shock lands, just the one forest because I know I just seen it, a snow covered forest and snow covered plains. Essentially, just so you can still cast like a lot of your spells through Blood Moon. The sideboard, you have Flusterstorms, Veil of Summers, just to kind of like protect your stuff. Destructive Revelry against some annoying artifacts and enchantments. Of course, like things like the bridge will be very annoying for you to deal with. Destructive Revelry is just a way to kind of get some like tempo, getting to destroy their thing, deal some damage to them, keep the pressure on. Rest in Peace for those pesky living index. Rest in Peace kind of hoses them pretty hard while you don't care about your graveyard necessarily. Deafening Clarion can be a way to wipe the board against some of the smaller creature decks and then also get a huge life total swing. Very hard when your opponent, you wipe the board and then you just gain 9 to 13 life on your opponent and they have to find a way to compete with that. Hetsugu consumes all. Another like super aggressive creature. Definitely hoses like some of the hammer decks by just going to destroy a bunch of permits with mana value 1 or less. Exiling the graveyards as well has some utility against some of the graveyard decks, and of course the Trampler on the side, on the other side of it, that can make combat a nightmare, especially with a Scion or Draco, just meaning that it has trample, first strike, and lifelink. A lot of relevant text on a card that will just eventually kill your opponent if they're not careful. And of course, 2 Unmoored Ego. Get to name a card and search for up to 4 cards with that name and then exile them. And then your opponent draws a card from each card in their hand that was exiled this way. Of course, can name like Tron lands and things like that. Also, just gets to hit the other spells and stuff in the deck. That can be very hard for you to deal with. I mean, you're really, this is like your way of like beating combo decks where like Stubborn Denial might not be able to help you in those situations. Also, of note that like a lot of these cards get to pull double duty in the fact that like they allow you to play Jingotha as your companion, regardless of how you sideboard and things like that. So really neat. That's the Domain Zoo deck. Bare bones simple. You are a, I'm gonna say fancy aggro deck because you care about your lands, basic land types. You have to be very mindful when fetching. Like that's probably one of the hardest parts of the deck. It's just kind of, two landers like trying to figure out if you're able to go for a Triome on turn 1 or if you have to go for it on turn 2, things like that. Super important things to kind of figure out when you're trying to fetch and stuff and play with this deck, because those things can get you if you're hoping to play a Draco for 2 mana and you end up fetching up 2 fetch lands, or you fetch up a Triome and then you fetch up the wrong shock land that ends up sharing a type with one of your Triomes and stuff. So definitely things to keep in mind when playing this deck. And yeah, I hope you guys all enjoyed the video. Of course, again, if you have not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more content like this, see some Pioneer stuff, some gameplay streams, all that fun and happy stuff, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of that stuff. Ring the notification bell so you get notified when videos and said streams go live. Join the Discord server in the description of this video. Go ahead, follow the link, slap it in there, and go ahead and join. Always love talking about Magic and things like that. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I will see you all in the next one.